Hey everybody, how's it going? It's Flying Crow. I just wanted to do a short little video on soldering. I know there's a bunch of soldering videos out on YouTube, but you know, maybe you haven't seen them, you haven't come across one, something like that. You know, so I just wanted to do one, make sure that everyone is aware how to solder to get a good solder joint. Okay, because a lot of times I'll see solder joints that are gray and granular looking, and so that you know, that comes from the material not being heated enough. So you want to make sure when you do a soldering job that you heat your material and not the solder. Okay. Another thing you want to make sure of is that the track you're using or whatever you're soldering is good and clean. Okay, and the way I do that, if it's something that's been dirty, this hasn't. This is a brand new track. It hadn't been painted or anything, so it's fairly clean. If you think something's a little bit dirty, you can wipe it with some acetone or some alcohol. Something like that would be certainly appropriate. But when I'm soldering stuff like this, I always use acid flux. Now, if you're doing a DCC install in your locomotive, you definitely don't use acid flux, okay? Don't, because you'll destroy the little circuit board if you try to use some acid flux on it. So you either use a special type of flux for microelectronics, or you use just a rosin core solder without any flux, okay? So just be aware of that. Doing something like rail, acid flux is totally appropriate. Okay, so this ensures a good clean material and gives you a good solid solder joint. So what I'm going to do is I am going to wipe a little flux on here where I'm going to be soldering. Okay, and I'm going to do it on the other side, but I'm also going to put flux on the end of my wire too. Okay, because I want to make sure there's no oxidation on the wire itself, even though I just stripped it. Another thing is I want to make sure my soldering tip, now you see this tip now? See how it's kind of crusty looking? Alright, so what I want to do is I want to make sure it's tinned. That means it's got solder on it, but I also want to make sure it's clean. And to do that, I'm going to dip it in the flux. You can hear it heating up there. And then I'm going to wipe it on my wet sponge over here. Okay, and I'm going to put, I think I'm just going to add a little bit of solder to it just to make sure it's good and tinned. I'm just going to tin it with some solder. And then I'm going to go back into my flux and my sponge just to wipe off the excess. So now I've got a nice silvery looking tip. Okay, and I want to make sure I get all that excess solder off of there. So if you have to re-dip it in your flux and run it back over your sponge, that is fine. Okay, so now what I want to do is, first of all, I'm going to put some solder on the rail. Okay, and to do that, I want to use some heat sinks, especially around turnouts. Okay, switches, you don't want to be melting, you know, this area up here on the switch where it's holding the point rails and all that kind of stuff. That wouldn't be good. So I put my heat sink here, you know, on the other side of where I'm going to solder, and I really don't want it going too far back either. So I'm going to put another heat sink there. Alright, so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to heat this area up real nicely. Okay, so you want to heat this up really well and then touch the solder to it and let the solder melt into it. Okay, I don't want to melt the solder onto it. I want to get this nice and hot. And then you can see once I get it nice and hot, I'm going to touch the solder to it and the solder should melt into it. Okay, well it isn't yet, and that means it's just not hot enough. So always make sure your work is good and hot. And you see, this is why I'm using the heat sinks, because I could be melting all my ties. Alright, now look at that. See how the solder's just flowing into the rail? Okay, so that's what I want. That's what I want. And then I smooth it out a little bit with my tip. And I want to use, I get a fair amount of solder, but I don't want to get enough to clog up the rail area, alright? Alright, now I'm going to do the same thing for the end of my wire. And I only stripped about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch off. And the reason you do that is because the soldering iron's going to melt. The soldering iron's going to melt some of the insulation anyway. Alright, so I want to touch the tip. Alright, and then I want to put the solder onto it. Let the solder flow back towards the soldering iron. It'll flow towards the heat. Okay? There we go. And so now look at my, if I can get my camera to focus. So look how nice and shiny that is. And that's what you want. You want to make sure it's good and shiny. I'm going to keep my tip clean. Every time I solder, I'm going to go back into my flux and my sponge and clean my tip. Okay? Now, I've got solder on the rail. I've got solder on my wire, and you can see I've bent it at 90 degrees, and I'm just going to bend it again at another 90 degrees so it presses up against the rail. Alright, and I hope my hand's not getting in the way too much, so I probably should have turned it the other way is what I should have done. There we go. Whatever you do when you're soldering, you keep your work clean. That's the most important thing. And I'm going to see, I might have just to hold it with something else. But a lot of times I can take my heat sink there and just clip it on there. So I want to push the wire kind of into the groove of the rail is the way I like to do it. As long as the wire is soldered to the rail, and as long as it doesn't derail your trains, you did it right. I have to just make one mention though. I'm using number 18 gauge bell wire for my leads, okay? You can use stranded wire if you want. It'll conduct just as well. The only problem is you're going to cause yourself a lot of pain when you're trying to solder stranded wire to this rail. So that's why I just use plain old single stranded bell wire. Okay, let me get some. Alright, now all I need to do now, because everything's got solder on it, is if I can just come in here and touch it, and it should melt the solder together that I have on the rail and the wire. And I should end up with a nice strong solder joint. Okay. Give that just a few seconds to cool. Okay, and I'm going to pull from below. And you see that ain't coming off. And that's just because it's a good solid joint. It's shiny, which is what you want. You want a nice shiny joint, and that's that'll tell you you did it correctly. If it's a gray and granular looking, then you have what's called a cold solder joint, and it's not going to hold, and it's not going to conduct electricity as well. Okay, let's do one more. Now this one's a little harder because you see I've already painted the track. Alright, so it's going to be a little bit different. We're going to have to clean this first. And we're going to have to clean it thoroughly. So the first thing I'm going to do is put some of my flux on it. And as you can see, I think I'm going to slide these out because these are just going to be fill-ins once I do it. I don't have to clean both sides, just the side I'm soldering to, obviously. Okay. And the flux will get a lot of the grimy out. And I've got to do the other side too. But it's not gonna get all of it. Alright. Let's just wipe it away and see what we got. Had to help some, but let's get some of this acetone in here. So I use acetone. You can use alcohol, whatever you want, whatever, as long as it cleans it. That's all we're worried about. Yeah, that's coming off nicely now. As you can see. And I can just go back and repaint it once I'm done soldering it. Make sure I don't leave any trash in between the rails. Yeah, that's nice. Now let me take a toothpick here. And I'm using a toothpick because I don't want to damage the track necessarily. You know, by scraping it with a file or something like that. I might have to, depending on how dirty it is. Let's see, you can probably even see it better on camera than I'm seeing it. It's got a nice clean rail joiner again. Yeah, there's a nice clean spot right there. Good. I'm going to do the same to the other side. While I'm here, just put a little more flux on it. I'm going to use the flux on the end of the toothpick here. And this flux, you know, like I said, is acid based, so it's just going to kind of eat into it. Alright, I'm going to get some acetone on my paper towel here. Wipe in there just to get all the excess grime out. Yeah, it's nice and clean now. So that's what you want. You want to start out with a good clean surface to solder on. Okay. Alright. I don't know how well you can tell. It doesn't look as clean as it does here. So I'm just going to come, just in case, I'm going to come in and kind of hit it with this file. Yeah, I think I'm scraping a little more out of it. All right. So, never hurts to be overly clean with it. You can clean too little, but you can't clean too much. Just remember that. All right, so you see how nice and shiny that is now. That's good. That's what we want. All right. So I'm going to come back in here. Once again, I'm going to place my heat sinks in there. And I'm only going to do this side for the camera. So I want to make sure the tip of my soldering iron is nice and shiny. Okay. And if it had hit the light, it'd look better. But and then I'm going to take, I'm just going to take this toothpick and I'm just going to dab on a little more flux where I'm going to solder just in case. Like I said, you can't have it too clean. And once again, I'm going to heat up the area where I want the solder to flow. I'm going to just look at that. See? When I touch the solder, it's just melting into the area. And I'm just going to take the tip of my soldering iron to smooth it a little bit. Okay? There we go. So, what you want to end up with is something nice and shiny always. Alright, so I'm going to take my wire and strip it. And like I said, I'm only going to strip about 1/4 of an inch off because it'll melt. The soldering iron will melt. Oh, what's wrong? Let's have something stuck in my. There we go. Huh. Well, that's the first time that's happened. Of course, it's going to happen on camera. Just cut it a little shorter. Alright, so I'm going to bend it at a 90-degree angle. Put a little flux on the end of the wire. Make sure there's no oxidation. And I'm going to come in here with a nice clean soldering iron and touch it, and then I'm just going to lay the solder on it. Heat it up, and there you go. Let the solder melt into the work. Alright, once again I can smooth it with my soldering iron. So, okay, so we've got a nice shiny solder on the wire and a nice shiny solder on the rail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and heat the rail up again. Look at that. And my hand's burning. So there you go. Just a nice joint. I'm going to pull it from underneath the table just to take the slack out of the wire, but that also tests to make sure I've got a good solder joint, and I do, because the solder joint doesn't pull off. All right. And if you do get any solder up on top of the rail, I didn't. I have before, but not in this case. You can just come along with a little file and knock it off. But all right, that's the way you put solder on something, a joint that you have to clean first. So I hope you have enjoyed this short little soldering demonstration. And once again, like I said, if you have any questions, just let me know and I will be glad to answer. Thanks. Y'all have a good evening.